Hello, this is Michael Smith, and this is lecture number 2 for Anthropology 400. Last time we talked about the basics of understanding anthropology, about how people live and function within certain cultures and within certain groups, and how we manage to work to make those things happen, coming from different backgrounds and different peoples, groups, and all over the world. Today we would like to spend our time discussing ethnography, which is the science of anthropology, and how we do research to find out about other peoples. There's a great deal of archaeological work being done and ethnographic work around the world looking at early cultures, trying to understand how man manages to function, how we survive working together. You see, people did not begin living in groups. They started out as hunters and gatherers, the term that you might have heard before, because we still do have a few of those people that live in that kind of a culture. The Icon people in Africa and the Aborigines in Australia are two very different groups, but they are all within that hunters and gatherers kind of culture. All people started out as that in very small groups, looking, gathering food, trying to survive before they ever started to live together as a culture in cities and towns. One of the interesting researches of late about those groups of people, when you think of hunters and gatherers, you think of people that probably spend 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, attempting to get enough food to live. Well, those groups have been studied in recent years, and the truth about the matter is very startling. First of all, it only takes about 2.5 days a week, working 6 hours a day. So you're talking about 15 hours a week in order to gather enough food to survive for these people. And then the rest of the time they have is for recreation, which is, whatever it is that they do for recreation. The fact is that Americans and the Japanese they work more hours per week than any other people in the world. So you can go figure when you think about that, because we average 48 hours a week, most Americans do in their work life. So we have the least recreational time and we have the most work hours. So these are the kind of things that we look at when we do these kinds of research. And so it's important for us to talk about the history, the methods, the theories of how we look at certain groups of people. And ethnography, of course, is a detailed description of the primary culture, primarily based on firsthand observation and interactions. If you go and live with a tribe of people, I did that in the 80s in the Philippines, where they have rarely ever seen a Westerner or a white person go out and live in that tribe. I'll never forget my first day there. The chief wanted me to sit and eat lunch with him, and he handed me a bowl of live grub worms, and they ate the worms alive. Well, that's quite an experience among many others that I had, but it's one of those things where you say, okay, God, I'll get them down, but you keep them down. You always had that sensation that they're crawling in your stomach. But you go there and do firsthand observations. You interact with the people. You attempt to communicate and learn their language and all those things. But ethnology is the study and the analysis of different cultures from a comparative or a historical perspective. So you want to compare one culture to another to see what this culture learned over here that this one hadn't learned, what the cycle was, all those things. This all comes into the discussion within chapter 3 of our studies for this week. In the 1900s, and of course in the early days of America, we were establishing colonies in different areas of the world. In the 1600s, the Pilgrims came here, and you know that story fairly well probably, to set up a colony based on the fact that they were being religiously persecuted in England, and they came here for freedom and all those things that we talk about around the Thanksgiving season. But that was called colonialism, where you go and establish a colony among a different culture of people. The Native Americans that they chose to come here to build a colony among, were at first open to that. You realize that these are the things we're talking about in anthropology, how those two groups of people who are very different, one is very European, one is Native American, how those two groups interacted, what were the stressors, and what was it that caused them to be antagonistic to each other. And it was not just on one side. There are discussions on both sides between the settlers and Native Americans. But they established colonies here, and then they began to move here, and that whole thing began to become overpowering to the Native Americans as they looked at more and more hundreds of people moving onto their land and establishing colonies and then towns and then cities, until we literally took over the entire continent, pushed the people that were here into reservations, killed off many of them, and today we have a situation in which our Native American tribes are on reservations, and we actually control the continent. Those are all within anthropological points of discussion. Sometimes there are urgent needs to understand and to know more about what went on in a culture in order to solve some problem today. We have a resurgence recently of many old diseases that used to be quite prolific in the earlier days of the planet, that we need to go back and look and see if there are answers there that maybe we've missed along the way. That would be urgent anthropology. We take the things we learn in anthropology and we apply them to real world situations as ways of understanding or getting along or surviving or whatever else. That would be applied anthropology. And then there's what we call advocacy anthropology, that we use these things to prove and to show an application. For instance, in recent years, the DNA project in which we map the entire human genome project, in which we map the entire DNA structure of a human being, tells us many things. It tells you what ethnic groups you may have come from, that you carry genes from, say, Native American background or from Asia or from wherever. It gives us an indicator of where we're from, what our heritage is about. And those things are very, very important because we can use those to, for instance, we've learned from that Native Americans didn't always live on the North American continent, that they are direct descendants of Euro-Asians, and that they apparently probably came across on the land bridge between what is now Alaska and the North American continent during the Great Ice Age. And of course, then when that melted, the bridge went away, so it kind of left them stranded here to develop on their own lines. And it was interesting, I was this weekend at the Frontier Days in Cheyenne, Wyoming, looking at Native American dance, and realized what great similarities there were between Native American dance and the Asian dance. And so many elements that were similar were quite interesting to me. This spreading of peoples, this idea of Eurasians chasing or hunting the mammoths and following them over into this new continent, would be an example of diaspora, this spreading of peoples to the ends of the earth. And this has always been something that human beings have done since the beginning. Either they're following hunting patterns, or they're just curious or whatever. This is going to increase greatly, of course, in the 1800s, when we have millions of people who immigrate over to America. They bring their culture with them. In fact, there were entire German villages that uprooted and moved as a group to the New World and established their own village and town, still speaking the German language, still eating German food, going to German churches, those kinds of things, because that's what's called chain migration. When people move from one area to the other, they still want to live around people that speak their language, eat their food, practice their religion, wear their kind of clothing. And while people will assimilate into the surrounding areas, some refuse to. Again, the Mennonites and the Amish, who refuse to change with the times. You reject computers, they reject the change of clothing. Those of you that live around Ohio know, or Pennsylvania, there are huge communities of these folks that live there, and they're really being stretched by modern technologies, and especially with their children who are born with different ideas than their parents. And so, you don't let your child have a computer, or it doesn't get to watch TV, or doesn't get to listen to music. Those kind of things are changing even as we speak, and so more and more of them are being assimilated. That's the word, that you assimilate into the society that you are around. And so we study a lot of these sites, multi-sites, to look at the ethnographic evidence. We have all kinds of new tools now to use as far as computers and being able to image things even under the ground. So we can find like early villages or early towns, and we can look at those things from an ethnographic standpoint, all to understand more about our beginnings. Because the more we can understand about our beginnings, the better off we are with understanding how we are today and to project where we may be tomorrow. So it's very interesting work. There are both quantitative and qualitative data that comes from this type of research. Quantitative, of course, would be numbers, and we can tell how many people lived in a village, or how many people were farmers, or how many people were leather workers, or any of the other things. And then there's qualitative information. We can judge from these things the quality of life, how these people were living, what their longevity was, how long they lived, how did they die, those kind of things. One of the great things in archaeology that's always of interest is that, especially in the Middle East or in very dry climates, going through the garbage of a village, you can tell a great deal about what people threw away or got rid of along the way, about what kind of life that they had. So we go through these things very carefully, sifting for information. And that's what ethnographic research is, that you find things and then you draw conclusions from those things to make them applicable to whatever it is that you are studying. These things they elicit information that maybe we don't realize is there. When you go in to a village, for instance, and do a physical observation, you do informal interviews. They may not always be verbal, because some people do not have the ability to communicate in your language or you in theirs, but you can watch people and learn from the way they do things, many things about their cultural heritage. There's the term culture shock that you hear a lot of today. Culture shock has to do with someone that kind of gets transplanted into another culture, and they're just shocked either by how technologically savvy it is. It kind of blows their mind. The computer is probably the best example of that. I often say that my grandparents, who passed away in the 80s, never saw a debit card. They never saw a cell phone. They never saw a computer. They did have a TV. They had a radio. That was about the limit of the technology that they were able to grasp in their day. Now, some of you in starting school and doing online school, you've had to struggle with getting your computer skills, maybe you still do, getting your computer skills up to where you are able to function. And so you get a little bit of an understanding of culture shock. If you come from, the backwoods where I did, to do a computer was not my generation. I'm 62 years old. I've had to learn. I've had to adopt. I've had to adapt, and in order to survive in this society, because the truth is that these things will pass you by. You can sit around for years saying, I wish I had an education, I wish I could go to school, but unless you're willing to adopt some of this technology in order to function, then it's going to pass you by. We can all name people, and we can name communities where that's exactly what happened, that people basically got passed by in the process of the technology game. So it's important that we So as we move forward then in our discussion in chapter number 5, be sure to look at those things and look at the different perspectives that we have to deal with in thinking about the cultural anthropology and things of importance. And then we'll talk next time about language.